Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning into this Sprint Tax non-resident tax webinar for the 2021 tax filing season. My name is Anna Fitzpatrick and I'm from the team here at Sprint Tax. And in today's session, I'm hoping to bring you through a couple of things you might need to know about non-resident tax as you get ready to prepare your tax returns for this tax filing season. Before we kick off, generally because it's tax we're talking about, we always have to start off with a disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give everyone a general understanding of non-resident tax as it applies to non-resident international students, scholars and professionals in the US. So we'd say here at Sprint Tax, like tax is a little bit like your own DNA. And although you may seem nearly identical on paper to your fellow international students or scholars, one minor detail could make you be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So with that said, it's important to keep in mind that each individual has their own unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and tax compliance. But looking at what I'll aim to cover in today's session, I'll look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars, looking at some core non-resident tax information that you might need to be aware of, like important dates for the tax filing season, residency for tax purposes. I'll also go through using Sprint Tax to prepare your tax returns, as well as another solution, Sprint Tax forms that we have in place that can be used for any pre-employment forms that you might need. But when we're looking at the tax filing season, generally a good place to start is around the important dates for 2021. And when we're looking at the 2021 tax filing season, we're looking back on the 2021 tax year. And we're looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2021. And really, we're looking back on that period to any income that you earned during the period, as well as any taxes that were withheld on that income. And really, ultimately, we're looking to see if you might have over or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. The really important date, the tax filing deadline for the 2021 tax filing season is Monday, April 18th, 2022. For anyone who was here in prior tax seasons, for the last two tax seasons, you may have been familiar that we did have extensions for the last two tax seasons given the pandemic. But as it stands, there's no indication that there'll be an extension this year. So important to keep in mind that the deadline stands at Monday, April 18th, 2022. And next, the concept of residency for tax purposes is definitely something that tends to confuse a lot of international students and scholars and professionals in the US. So I'll break it down a little bit for everyone. The first important thing to mention is that residency for tax purposes is independent of your visa and immigration status. So generally, most international students and scholars who are on F, J, M or Q visas are considered non-residents for tax purposes. If you're an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, you'd automatically be considered a non-resident for your first 5 calendar years in the US. So you'll hear I mentioned it's a calendar year that we're looking at here. And just to give you an example, if Anna entered into the US on December 31st, 2021, but her semester at her university didn't kick off until January of 2022, the IRS would count 2021 as Anna's first calendar year of presence in the US, as she was actually present on US soil during the 2021 tax year. Then if we're looking at scholars and researchers and their dependents on J visas, they're automatically considered non-residents for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years in the US. After those 6 calendar years, then the clocks would reset and you get another 2 years of non-resident status. Then if you've been in the US for longer than that 5-year period, if you are an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, or that 2-year period if you are a J researcher or scholar, then the IRS will need to use what is called the substantial presence test to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially this test looks back on the previous 3 years and it's looking at your days of presence in order to determine your residency for tax purposes. Essentially, it will take all of the days of presence for the current year, then it will take a third of days of presence in the year before the current year, and a sixth of days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to over 183 days, then you would be deemed a resident for tax purposes. The good news here is that if you're using Sprintax to prepare your tax returns, we can do the thinking here for you. We'll ask you residency related questions and we'll let you know if you are a resident for tax purposes so you can file accordingly. A big question is around who actually needs to file for the 2021 tax filing season. And importantly, every non-resident needs to do something and every non-resident has some type of IRS filing obligation. The minimum filing requirement for non-residents is typically Form 8843, and this needs to be prepared and filed by each non-resident who is an exempt individual who is present on US soil during the tax year as a non-resident. And importantly, it also needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. Essentially, it's a declaration or confirmation of your non-resident status. So you're letting the IRS know you're a non-resident for tax purposes, so don't count these days of presence towards the substantial presence test. But in many cases, you may have been also in receipt of US income during the tax year. So perhaps you had an on-campus employment job, perhaps you had an off-campus employment job, you had any type of employment. You might have had scholarships, stipends, investment income, crypto, for example. And as there's no personal exemption amount for 2021, if you receive any taxable US sourced income as a non-resident in the US, you'll typically be required to report that on your federal tax return, which is Form 1040 NOR. And for anyone who was here in prior tax seasons, you may have been familiar with the 1040 NOR EZ. This was a federal return form that was used in prior tax seasons, but it has since been discontinued since the 2020 tax filing season. A very important slide on some of the tax documents or the income documents that you might receive as a non-resident to report the income that you received during the tax year. So we have the W-2, the 1042S and the 1099 series documents. The W-2 is typically used to outline any wages, any salary, any compensation that was earned during the tax year, as well as any taxes that were withheld on that income. The deadline to receive a W-2 if you're due to receive one would be by January 31st, 2022. Then probably second most common after the W-2 would be the 1042S form. And this is typically used to report any taxable scholarships or stipends, any income exempt by a tax treaty, any royalty payments, prizes or awards would typically all be reported on a 1042S form. Again, the deadline to receive a 1042S if you're due to receive one would be by March 15th, 2022. Lastly, then the 1099 series documents, they're probably less common for non-residents, but you may receive a 1099 to report any rental income, investment income, or commissions, for example. So if you do receive income documents, you will need them when you're sitting down to prepare your tax returns, so make sure you have them to hand, any income documents that are applicable to you. And lastly, just to give you a quick overview of some of the Sprintax solutions that we have in place that may be useful for you, for both for the tax season and perhaps if you are kicking off or starting a new employment. The first is Sprintax Returns or Sprintax Tax Prep, and this is a system that can be used to assist with your non-resident tax returns. It can assist with federal returns, Form 8843, state returns, as well as other services like preparing the W7 for the ITIN or FICA FICA refund forms, for example. So what the system will require from you is you'll need to set up an account. You will answer a tax-based questionnaire, for example, around your residency, your income information, state taxes, college details, for example. And from the information you provide on the system will be able to figure out what your filing requirements are, as well as prepare any returns for you. Also, for anyone who may have used us last year, you may have been familiar that we introduced e-filing for federal tax returns, which we were super excited about, and that is in place again for this tax season. On the e-filing side, it will depend on your circumstances whether you are eligible to e-file. If you are eligible to e-file your federal return, this option will be outlined to you. If not, you'll be able to print, sign and mail the return. And also on the state tax return side, this will still need to be printed, signed and mailed, but you will get a tax pack with detailed instructions on exactly how to go about doing that. The second system that we thought might be useful to share with you is around our Sprint Tax form system. And this is a system that can be used to generate any pre-employment tax documents that you might need. So Sprint Tax forms, you can create an account similar to how you would do on Sprint Tax returns. You'll answer a tax-based questionnaire, and the system can figure out your residency for tax purposes, your tax treaty eligibility, as well as generate any pre-employment tax documents that might be applicable to you, such as the W4 or the W8BEN or the 8233. And for example, it can also assist with determining whether you should be exempt from FICA or not. And all of this information can be provided to your employer. You can print and sign the tax forms and provide them to your employer, and ultimately will help to make sure that you're taxed correctly on that income from that employer. Important to keep in mind that this is separate to any end of year tax filing that you might need to do. So as I went through on the Sprint Tax returns, that system helps with preparing tax returns and reporting your income that you received during the tax year on that tax return. Whereas this system will help with any pre-employment tax documents that you might need before you kick off your employment. So just important to remember the difference there between the two. So with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I hope you found that short overview of some tax filing requirements as well as some Sprint Tax solutions helpful. If you have any additional queries, we do have 24/7 live chat on the system during tax filing season, so feel free to reach out there. We also have a support email, hello@sprinttax.com. But again, thanks everyone for watching. I hope you found it helpful, and best of luck with your tax filing obligations.